The autumn wind in the high divide of Montana Territory had a way of getting under a man's skin, not with cold, but with a dry, relentless insistence. It scraped the color from the grass, leaving behind a pale, tired yellow, and whipped the red dust into devils that danced across the cracked earth. The sky was a high, terrifying blue, so vast it could make a man feel like a forgotten speck. At night, the stars didn't twinkle. They spilled across the blackness like a sack of salt tipped over on a dark wood floor. Elias Hart, at 32 years of age, knew this land. He was the owner of Hart's Draw, a stretch of rangeland that was more rock and grit than pasture. But it was his. He was a man built like the fence posts he spent his days sinking sturdy, weathered, and not given to bending. His words were few because he'd learned early that most things worth saying didn't need a lot of decoration. He lived alone, a condition that had been settled on him not by choice, but by a fever that had swept through the territory a few years back, taking his younger sister and her small boy with it. Now, his only company was a herd of longhorn cattle and an old horse named Luther. He had a habit of riding out to the herd not just to count heads, but to count his memories. Each cow was a solid, living thing, something to anchor the ghosts. His life ran on a simple creed: trust in strong fences and few promises. A fence told you exactly where you stood. A promise was just air until it was kept, and he'd seen too much air in his time. His evenings were measured by the routine of supper. Always beans from a can, a dry biscuit, and coffee so black and bitter it could strip paint. He ate at a small table facing the hearth, where the fire threw shadows that danced like troubled spirits. On the rough-hewn mantelpiece, placed squarely in the center, sat a pair of tiny leather shoes. They were scuffed at the toes from the unsteady steps of a child who would never grow to fill a man's boots. They were all he had left of his nephew, a silent testament to a life cut short, a future that had vanished like a puddle in the summer sun. The silence of his cabin was a living thing. It was in the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind through the chinks in the logs, the steady tick of a clock he didn't own. The narrative of his life was told in what was absent. He moved through his days with a deliberate economy of motion. His mind a quiet, guarded place. This was a man who survived. But the question of whether he was truly living was a splinter he carried deep inside. Beyond his property line lay the town of Sundown, a place as poor in spirit as it was in coin. It was a town that held its virtue close, a thin blanket against the harsh realities of the frontier. At one end of its single dusty street stood the white clapboard church, its steeple a sharp finger pointing at heaven, a constant reminder of judgment. At the other end, the swinging doors of the saloon offered a different kind of salvation, one that came in a whiskey glass. The two buildings stood like a pair of mismatched eyes, one watching for sin, the other profiting from it. Lately, the talk in Sundown, what little of it reached Elias on his infrequent trips for supplies, was of the railroad. The Pike & Company was rumored to be laying a spur for the Bitterroot Line, a vein of iron that would pump new blood or new trouble into the territory. Progress, they called it. Elias called it noise. He'd seen what followed the railroad men with smooth hands and slick words. Men who saw the land not for what it was, but for what could be gouged out of it. It was a tide of change, and Elias had built his life on things that stayed put. There was other talk, too, softer but just as persistent. A woman had arrived in Sundown. She had come in on the stagecoach, alone, which was enough to set tongues wagging. She wore a simple dress of worn fabric, but folks noted it was neatly mended, the stitches small and even. She kept to herself, her eyes taking in everything without giving anything away. The women of the town, peering from behind their curtains and over their shop counters, had already passed their verdict. A woman without a husband. They whispered to each other. Was just trouble wearing a skirt. Elias heard the gossip from the storekeeper while buying a sack of flour and paid it no mind. A lone woman was her own business. He had fences to mend. He rode out the next morning with Luther. his old gray horse, whose loyalty was as steady and predictable as the turning of the seasons. The wire had snapped in the west pasture, a clean break that needed splicing. As he worked, twisting the cold metal with his pliers, he spoke to the horse. "Luther," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you're as faithful as property taxes. You show up every year, whether I want you to or not." The horse flicked an ear but didn't otherwise respond. Accustomed to his master's one-sided conversations, Elias finished the splice, testing its strength with a firm tug. A good fence was a thing of beauty. It was honest. It did its job without complaint. Back at the cabin, he drew water from the stone well in the yard. The well was deep, the stones cool and mossy even in the dry heat. Pulling up the bucket was a slow, steady effort, a draw from the quiet, dark places of the earth. The water was always cold and clean, a stark contrast to the dusty world above. The well was like Elias himself. Getting anything out of it required patience and a strong arm. You had to pull it up from the silence. He was washing the dust from his face when he saw the rider approaching, a boy from town who sometimes delivered mail to the outlying ranches for a few cents. The boy handed him a crisp envelope, sealed with a smart wax emblem. Elias thanked him with a nod and a coin. He waited until the boy was a small dot on the horizon before opening it. The paper was thick, expensive. The words were printed in a confident, flowing script. It was a letter from a Mr. Bartholomew Pike, president of the Pike and Company Railroad. It spoke of progress and the future of Montana. It spoke of the public good and community prosperity. Then it got to the point. The company, for the benefit of all, wished to purchase the section of his land that ran through the small valley, the very part that held the deep spring that fed Hart's Draw and kept his cattle alive through the dry season. The offer was polite, reasonable, and carried the unstated weight of inevitability. Elias read the letter twice. A cold knot formed in his stomach. The public good. He looked out at the vast, empty land that stretched before him. His public, his community. It consisted of him, a gray horse, and a herd of cattle that didn't care about railroads. He looked back at the cabin, at the smoke curling from the stone chimney. He thought of the little shoes on the mantelpiece. This land wasn't just a piece of property on a map. It was a promise he'd made to himself, a place to hold what was left of his world together. The letter was a stone tossed into the quiet well of his life. He could feel the ripples spreading, disturbing the hard-won peace. Love, he'd always thought, was like a small fire you tried to keep alive against a relentless wind. He had lost his fire years ago. Now, all he had was the wind, and it was starting to blow from a new direction, carrying the scent of iron and money and trouble. He folded the letter, the sharp creases a reflection of the hard lines forming around his mouth. Pike and Company had made an offer. Elias Hart had a fence to defend. 3 days after the letter from Pike and Company arrived, the sky turned the color of a bad bruise. Elias was guiding his wagon down the rutted track toward sundown, the bed loaded with heavy blocks of salt for his cattle. The air grew thick and still, a heavy silence that always came before the wind. When it hit, it came as a sudden, violent shove, throwing a sheet of red dust so thick it blotted out the sun. He pulled his hat down low and urged Luther forward. His eyes narrowed to slits. Through the gritty haze, a shape loomed on the road ahead. It was the weekly stagecoach, listing badly to one side like a wounded animal. One of its rear wheels had splintered, the thick spokes jutting out at broken angles. The passengers, a handful of men in dusty coats and one woman, were huddled on the leeward side of the coach, their backs to the stinging wind. The driver was cursing at the broken axle, his words snatched away by the gale. Elias pulled his wagon alongside them and set the brake. He dismounted, wrapping a kerchief over his nose and mouth. The passengers looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, their faces already caked with a fine layer of dust. He gave a short nod to the driver. "Trouble," he said, his voice flat. The driver spat a stream of brown tobacco juice that the wind immediately threw back at him. Axel snapped clean. "We are not going anywhere." Elias's gaze moved over the small group and settled on the woman. She was standing slightly apart from the men, a small, locked wooden box held tightly in both hands. She was perhaps 27, with hands that looked accustomed to hard work, the knuckles reddened and the skin rough. Her dress was plain and faded, but a tear near the hem had been repaired with a line of stitching so fine it was nearly invisible. She met his look without flinching, her eyes a steady, watchful gray. It was a strange look, he thought, as if she were scanning the horizon for a threat she knew was coming, as if she expected every face to be one she recognized with dread. He turned his attention back to the problem at hand. "We can take you to town," he told the driver, jerking his head toward his wagon. "It is better than breathing this dirt." The passengers began to move, grateful for the offer. The men climbed into the back of the wagon, settling themselves between the salt blocks. The woman, however, hesitated. Elias waited. She looked from his face to the wagon and back again, a flicker of indecision in her eyes. Finally, with a quiet resolve, she climbed up onto the driver's bench beside him. It was a tight fit, but she seemed to make herself smaller, taking up as little space as possible. The ride to sundown was a silent battle against the wind. The dust was relentless, finding its way into every fold of their clothing as the wagon jolted over a particularly deep rut. A small object was dislodged from a loose floorboard of the broken-down coach and clattered onto the wagon's footboard. It was a piece of metal, blackened and scorched as if it had been pulled from a fire. Elias saw it glint in the dim light. Etched into its surface were two letters, SC. Before he could get a better look, the woman's hand darted out and snatched it up. Her movement was so swift, so final, that it was as if the object had never been there at all. She slipped it into a pocket of her dress without a word, her knuckles white as she clutched her wooden box again. Elias saw the whole thing, the letters on the metal, the fear in her quick motion. He turned his eyes back to the road and said nothing. By the time they reached the edge of sundown, the wind was beginning to die down, leaving a red pall hanging in the air. He pulled the wagon up in front of the boarding house. The passengers climbed down, mumbling their thanks, eager to find a drink and wash the grit from their throats. The woman remained on the bench. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but clear. Her name was Mara Quinn, she added, as if offering a piece of currency for the ride. Elias just nodded. "If I did not help," he replied, "the sand would get in my eyes too." It was the closest he could come to a polite sentiment, a kindness couched in the harsh logic of the land. It was a place where decency was often a matter of shared survival, not soft words. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, accepting his statement for what it was. Then she slid down from the bench, her small box held securely, and disappeared into the boarding house. The arrival of a single woman, blown in on a dust storm, did not go unnoticed. Reverend Barlow, a man whose piety was as thin as his hair, was seen peering through the window of the parsonage, a look of profound concern on his face for the moral fabric of his town. More practically, Agnes Pike, the proprietor of the Sundown Mercantile, took immediate interest. Agnes was a woman who smiled with her eyes while calculating profits with the precision of a hawk. She was also a cousin to Bartholomew Pike, a fact that gave her an unshakable position in the town's small hierarchy. The next day, Mara Quinn walked into the Mercantile. Elias was there, negotiating the price of barbed wire with Agnes, a monthly ritual in which they both knew who would win. He watched as Mara approached the counter. She was looking for work. She stated simply, she could keep books, she could sew, she could mend anything from a canvas tarp to a lace collar. Agnes Pike looked her up and down, her eyes lingering on Mara's capable hands. She named a wage that was barely enough to cover room and board. Mara accepted without haggling. The arrangement was made. Agnes had found herself a skilled and cheap employee. But as Mara began her work in a small corner of the store, Elias noticed Agnes watching her, her gaze sharp and speculative, the way a person might watch a stray dog they had let into the house, unsure if it would prove useful or bite. Elias finished his business and loaded his supplies. He did not know why he did it, but on his way out of town, he stopped his wagon again near the boarding house. He took a small sack of flour from his provisions and left it on the stoop outside the door to the cheapest room, the one with the northern exposure that caught the worst of the weather. On a scrap of paper, he wrote a few words, his handwriting clumsy and blockish. Bolt the north window. The wind in sundown cuts like a rumor. He left it tucked under the string of the flour sack and drove away without looking back. As he rode toward the open spaces of Hart's Draw, he thought of her. He saw in Mara Quinn a kind of endurance he recognized. It was the resilience of the dry earth itself, cracked and weathered, waiting patiently for a rain that might never come. The world, however, was not content to leave him to his thoughts or his fences. Another letter arrived from Bartholomew Pike a few days later. This one was not a private offer. It was a public invitation, printed on the same thick paper, delivered to every landowner and business in the area. It cordially invited him to a town meeting to be held in the church. The topic was a proposal for a new reservoir, a project that promised to secure Sundown's future with a guaranteed supply of water. A map was included with the invitation. Elias unfolded it. A neat circle had been drawn to indicate the proposed location of the reservoir. It was centered directly over the spring in his valley. It was a friendly invitation to his own hanging. In her small, drafty room at the back of the boarding house, Mara Quinn sat on the edge of a narrow cot. The sack of flour sat on the floor, the note still tucked into its string. She had read it. She did not know what to make of the gesture. Kindness was a foreign currency here, and she was suspicious of its value. The wind rattled the window frame, a persistent, searching sound. She placed her wooden box on her lap, her fingers tracing its smooth, worn surface. The lock was small and made of brass. Inside lay the reason she had come to this desolate place, the reason for the fear that was her constant companion. She held the box to her chest, a silent prayer forming in her mind. Leave no trace, she thought. Do not let anyone touch the wooden box. The wind howled, and it sounded like a warning. The days settled into a rhythm, as hard and unyielding as the land itself. Mara Quinn took her place behind the counter at the Sundown Mercantile, a silent figure in a sea of dusty male faces. She mended the torn shirts of miners, the canvas of freighters, and the dignity of worn-out dresses. Her needle a small, sharp instrument of order in a chaotic world. She kept the store's ledger, her numbers neat and clear, a stark contrast to the smudged and uncertain accounts of men buying on credit they might never repay. She learned to avoid the lingering stares, the clumsy attempts at conversation. Her replies were always brief, polite, and offered no purchase for further familiarity. A young boy named Timothy, who delivered the weekly newspaper, was one of the few who could draw more than a handful of words from her. He was a scrawny child with a shock of bright red hair and a persistent curiosity. One afternoon, watching her reattach a button to a thick wool coat, he asked, "Can you sew the wind, miss?" Mara paused, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "The wind?" "No," she said softly. "But I reckon the mouths of some of the ladies in this town would require a thread made of cactus spine." Timothy giggled and ran off, leaving her in the quiet hum of the store. Miles away, on the silent expanse of Hart's Draw, Elias Hart lived his own unvarying routine. He was a man of the earth, his days dictated by the needs of his land and his animals. He rose before the sun, the smell of saddle leather and old wood a constant presence in his cabin. He spent his mornings riding the fence lines, his eyes scanning for breaks in the wire, for any sign of weakness. The work was hard, physical and honest. He found a young calf mired in a muddy bog near the spring, its frightened cries thin in the vast emptiness. He worked for nearly an hour, using his rope and his own brute strength, the thick, cloying mud sucking at his boots, the smell of wet earth and panicked animal filling his nostrils. Finally, he pulled the creature free. The calf stumbled to its feet and ran back to its mother, and Elias felt a quiet, profound satisfaction. He had set a small piece of the world right. This was a language he understood. One afternoon, the high blue sky turned a sickly gray with astonishing speed. The temperature dropped, and the air grew heavy. Elias was in the high pasture and saw it coming, a dark curtain sweeping across the plains. It was not rain, but hail. He moved quickly, his shouts echoing as he drove the new calves and their mothers toward the meager shelter of a rocky overhang. The hailstones came down with a sound like 1,000 thrown rocks, hammering the dry ground, shredding the leaves from the few hardy trees. He stood with his back to the storm, his body a shield for a particularly spooked calf, the ice striking his hat and shoulders with stinging force. In sundown, the same storm hit with a roar, the hail clattering on the tin roofs of the town like a frantic drumbeat. Mara was at the mercantile, watching as Agnes Pike frantically tried to pull in sacks of seed and flour that had been left on the front porch. The wind drove the hail sideways, and the canvas awning was threatening to rip. Without a word, Mara went outside into the maelstrom. She grabbed the ropes of the awning while Agnes pulled at the merchandise, the two of them working against the storm's fury. They managed to drag everything inside just as the awning tore loose from one of its moorings, flapping wildly in the wind. Soaked and bruised, they stood in the doorway, watching the ice bounce and skitter across the dusty street. For a moment, they were not employer and employee, but two people united against a common, impartial enemy. Two people, miles apart, acting in the same rhythm of preservation. The moment passed, as the storm abated, leaving a strange, white sheen on the red dirt. Agnes Pike's suspicion returned. The generosity of the storm was forgotten. A free woman. She would whisper to her customers later, a woman with no ties is the shortest road to a mistake. Though Mara's ledgers were perfect to the penny, Agnes began to check them every night, her finger tracing each entry as if searching for a lie. She would unwrap a bolt of cloth that Mara had just measured and stored, remeasuring it herself. The message was clear. You are not trusted here. A few days later, Elias came to town. He had the letter from Pike and Company folded in his pocket, a hard square of paper that felt heavier each day. He saw Mara through the window of the mercantile, her head bent over the ledger, a single lamp pushing back the afternoon shadows. She looked tired. He did not plan it, but he found himself walking to the small cafe and buying a tin pot of coffee, black and strong. He carried it to the mercantile. He set it on the counter in front of her. For keeping the numbers straight, he said. It is hard work to make sense of other people's debts. Mara looked up, her gray eyes startled. She looked from his face to the steaming coffee pot. For the first time since he had met her, she gave a real smile. It was not a large smile, but it transformed her face, erasing some of the weariness. It was like watching a drop of oil find its way into a piece of rusted wire, a small, quiet easing of a long-held tension. Thank you, she said. His business in town was with the land office, a stuffy little room run by a clerk with ink-stained fingers. Elias had come to compare his own deed and survey map with the one on file. It was then that a new document was produced, a revised map, recently delivered by courier from Pike and Company. It showed a new boundary line, a neat, confident ink stroke that shifted the entire valley containing his spring into a newly designated area marked Public Utility Corridor. The map bore an official-looking seal, a heavy stamp of authenticity. But Elias looked closer. The ink of the seal was a slightly different shade from the official documents. It was a fake, but a good one. A lie dressed up as law. He rode away from town with a cold fire burning in his gut. He passed by the mercantile again. Mara was outside, sweeping the porch. She looked up as he approached. You write worse than the wind blowing sand. she said, a teasing note in her voice, a callback to the note he had left with the flower. He stopped Luther and looked down at her. "My writing is good enough to count cattle and keep a promise," he answered, his voice rougher than he intended. The moment of warmth was gone, replaced by the reality of their separate struggles. He rode on. The town of Sundown was populated by more than just suspicious merchants and ambitious railroad men. There was Deputy Cole, a young man with a sincere face and a law badge that seemed a little too big for his chest. He was decent and honest, but he was young, and he moved in the shadow of the town's sheriff, a man who seemed to enjoy Mr. Pike's cigars a little too much. There was Mr. O'Rourke, the blacksmith, a man with a voice like a rock slide and a heart as big as his anvil. And there was Nettie, the woman who ran the boarding house. She had a tongue that could peel paint, but Mara had seen her leave a bowl of broth outside the door of a sick tenant when she thought no one was looking. These were the people who formed the true fabric of the town, a weave of good intentions and human failings. For Mara, the mercantile became her small, contained world, and in that world, her wooden box was a constant, silent presence. She kept it under the counter during the day. Every time the door opened, letting in a gust of wind and a new customer, the contents of the box would shift with a faint, metallic clink. It was a sound only she could hear, the sound of memory rattling against the present. It was a reminder to stay quiet, to stay invisible. The tension in Sundown was a rope being pulled tighter each day. One morning, a notice was nailed to the post outside the mercantile. It was printed in the same bold type as the letters Elias had received. It was a final, public invitation. A meeting would be held in the church to discuss the glorious future of the town, a future to be secured by the construction of a new reservoir. All citizens were urged to attend and show their support. It was not a discussion. It was a trap, baited with the promise of progress, designed to catch the consent of the entire town in its jaws. Elias saw it when he rode in for supplies. He read the words, and he knew his time for quiet fence mending was over. The fight was no longer coming to him. It was here. The church was not a place Elias' heart visited often. He found more divinity in the wide, silent sky than in the cramped pews and stale air of the clapboard building. But tonight, the entire town of Sundown was packed inside, their Sunday clothes smelling of mothballs and anxious sweat. The air was thick with a forced piety, a nervous energy that had nothing to do with salvation. They had come to hear a sermon on progress, and the preacher was Bartholomew Pike. He stood at the pulpit, a man made of smooth edges and expensive wool. He did not belong in this town of rough hands and sun-cracked faces, and that was precisely the source of his power. He was the future, and they were the past. He smiled, a warm, reassuring expression that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice a rich baritone that filled the small church. He spoke of the harshness of their lives, the unforgiving sun, the constant struggle for water. He painted a picture of a future where the creek never ran dry, where their children would not have to watch the earth parch and the cattle grow thin. He spoke of a great reservoir, a pool of life and prosperity for all, water for everyone, he said, his hands spread wide as if offering a benediction. The crowd murmured its approval, their heads nodding in unison like wheat in a gentle breeze. They were thirsty, and he was promising an ocean. Elias stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence a silent, solid block of dissent. He listened to the smooth, easy words, and he heard the lie coiled beneath them. When Pike finished, to a smattering of hopeful applause, Elias's voice cut through the warm air like a shard of winter ice. "What public good is it?" he asked, not loudly, but with a clarity that made every head turn. "If the key to the pipeline is locked in your pocket." A shocked silence fell over the church. Bartholomew Pike's smile tightened, but he did not lose his composure. He was about to offer a placating response when his cousin, Agnes Pike, stood up from her front row pew. She did not look at Elias. Instead, her sharp gaze settled on Mara Quinn, who was sitting alone near the side wall, a small, still figure in the hostile sea of faces. "Speaking of the public good, Reverend," Agnes said, her voice dripping with false concern, "we must also be vigilant about the character of our town. It is with a heavy heart that I must report that several items, small things, but valuable nonetheless, have gone missing from my mercantile in recent weeks." The implication was as heavy and foul as smoke from a coal fire. Every woman in the church turned to stare at Mara. Their eyes were hard, judgmental. She was the outsider, the stranger, the easy answer to any question of wrongdoing. Mara did not flinch, but Elias saw the color drain from her face. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, an island of composure in a suddenly hostile ocean. Deputy Cole, standing near the door, shifted his weight, his face a mask of discomfort. He had seen the forged map in the land office. He knew this was wrong. He looked to Sheriff Maddox, a portly man whose loyalty was as pliable as the bill of his cap. The sheriff caught the young deputy's eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He leaned in close. "You are looking at it from the wrong angle." "Son," he whispered, his breath smelling of whiskey and compromise. The pressure in the room was immense, a physical weight pressing down on Mara. Before Pike could use the moment to his advantage, Elias spoke again. His voice was not the voice of a man making an argument. It was the voice of a man stating a fact. "She works honest," he said, his eyes fixed on Agnes Pike. "Her books are as clean as my own after a spring rain." The statement was simple, direct, and unshakable. It was his word, the word of a man known for his silence, against hers. He had not only challenged the Pikes' claim to his land, he had now publicly defended the town's chosen scapegoat. He had drawn a second line in the sand. Bartholomew Pike seized the opportunity to pivot. He raised his hands again, calling for calm. "This is precisely why we need order," he boomed, his voice full of manufactured reason. "In times of progress, there is always instability." He then proposed a solution, a private security service, funded by Pike and Company, to ensure the town's safety and protect its assets during this crucial period of development. A voluntary contribution, he called it, a way for every citizen to invest in a secure future for their children. The threat was veiled, but clear. Anyone who did not sign on, anyone who resisted, would not just be an opponent of the reservoir. They would be an enemy of order, a person who was against the safety of children. The rope had been tightened. The meeting dissolved into a swarm of quiet, anxious conversations. Elias left without another word, the glares of the townsfolk like arrows in his back. Later that night, a deep quiet fell over sundown. Elias, unable to find rest, left his cabin and walked out under the vast, star-filled sky. The wind was cold, carrying the distant, lonely sound of a wolf's howl, answered by another, then another. "They are having a meeting, too," he said to the darkness, "but they are honest about wanting to eat you." In her small room at the boarding house, Mara sat on her cot, the silence pressing in on her. The public accusation had flayed a layer of skin from her carefully constructed composure. She found the small jar on her stoop when she returned from the church. It was a simple clay pot filled with lanolin, the thick grease rendered from sheep's wool. Tucked beneath it was a scrap of paper, so blood does not stain the thread. She stared at the jar, at the clumsy, blockish handwriting. It was a kindness so unexpected, so practical, that it broke through her defenses. It was a gesture that acknowledged her not as a suspected thief, but as a woman whose hands were sore and pricked from her needle. It made the loneliness of her room feel 1,000 times deeper. A sharp, familiar itch began to burn on her upper arm. Beneath the long sleeve of her dress, it was an old scar, a mark she kept hidden from the world. The phantom pain of it was a harbinger of fear. a physical memory of a past she could not outrun. She stood and went to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Her hand went to her wooden box, which sat on the small table. Her fingers traced the lock, a talisman against the encroaching darkness. A choked whisper escaped her lips, a plea to the ghosts that haunted her. "Don't," she breathed. "Not again." The night deepened. A sudden clatter of hooves and a panicked whinny shattered the silence of the town. It came from the livery stable, a sound of pure animal terror. A loose board, a sudden night sound. Something had spooked one of the horses. The sound of splintering wood followed as the animal kicked against its stall. Without thinking, Mara grabbed her shawl and ran out the door. Her first instinct was always to soothe, to mend, at the same time. Elias, on his way back from checking his own horse at the stable, heard the commotion. He and Mara arrived at the livery door at the same moment. Inside, in the dim lantern light, a large bay horse was rearing and plunging in its stall, its eyes white with fear. As they worked together to calm the terrified animal, its flailing hoof caught the fabric of her sleeve, tearing it from cuff to shoulder. The rain had come with the darkness, a cold, steady drumming that turned the dust of sundown into a slick, dark mud. Inside the livery stable, the air was close, thick with the smell of wet hay, horses, and fear. The young bay gelding, its eyes rolling white in the swinging lantern light, crashed against the boards of its stall again. The sound of splintering wood was sharp and violent. Elias moved with a quiet, deliberate calm, his voice a low murmur. "Easy now, easy, boy." He held a length of rope, his movements fluid and certain. Mara stood near the stall door, her presence a small, steady point of stillness in the chaos. They worked without speaking, a natural, unspoken rhythm falling between them. He would move to the horse's head, drawing its attention, and she would slip behind to secure a loose board, her hands quick and sure. They managed to corner the frightened animal, its trembling flanks heaving, its breath coming in ragged, steaming snorts. As Elias reached for the horse's halter, the animal shied one last time, lashing out with a powerful kick. It was not aimed at either of them, but a final, explosive burst of terror. The horse's hoof, shod in heavy iron, caught the loose, torn fabric of Mara's sleeve. The worn cotton offered no resistance. It ripped away with a sound like tearing paper, exposing the pale skin of her arm from her shoulder to her elbow in the flickering, uncertain light. And there, on the soft flesh of her upper arm, was the scar. It was not the clean line of a surgical cut or the jagged track of an accidental wound. It was a brand. The skin was puckered and discolored, a permanent welt of raised tissue against the smoothness of her arm. The mark was artless and brutal. 2 letters burned forever into her skin. SC. Elias froze. The rope in his hand went slack. The lantern, hanging from a nearby hook, seemed to tremble, casting their shadows long and distorted against the stable wall. The 2 letters seared themselves into his vision. He had seen them before. They were an imperfect match, cruder and more vicious. But they were the same 2 letters from the seal on Pike & Company's forged map. The same initials that had been on the scorched piece of metal she had snatched from the wagon. The brand on her arm was the same mark that was trying to steal his land, the world, which had felt vast and disconnected, suddenly snapped into a single, sharp, terrible focus. Mara made a choked sound and stumbled back, her hand flying to cover the mark, to hide the exposed, shameful truth of her body. Her face, already pale, became a bloodless mask of pure terror. She looked at Elias, at the shock on his face, and a lifetime of fear rose in her throat. Her voice was a ragged whisper, a thread of sound nearly lost in the drumming of the rain on the roof. "Please," she begged, her eyes wide and pleading. "Not again." The rancher looked, and he was speechless. Words were stones he kept in a deep well. and at that moment, the well was empty. He could not speak because the sight of the brand had ignited a rage so cold and so profound, it stole the air from his lungs. It was not disgust that held him silent. It was not judgment. It was the speechless, primal fury of a man witnessing an unforgivable violation. It was the anger of a man who believed in fences, in boundaries, in the simple right of a living thing to be whole and unmarked. Someone had taken a hot iron and written a claim of ownership on human skin, and the sheer, brutal arrogance of it left him without words. When he finally found his voice, it was a low, gravelly thing, each word carefully excavated from the depths of his anger. He took a slow step toward her, not touching, just closing a small part of the distance she had created. "Whoever touched you that first time," he said, his voice as steady and hard as granite, "I will remember his face. If it happens again, he pays for it." The simple, solemn promise hung in the air between them. It was not a threat made in heat, but a statement of fact, a vow as solid as the ground beneath their feet. Tears welled in Mara's eyes, but she did not let them fall. She looked at the raw sincerity in his face, and a wall inside her that had stood for years began to crumble. They stood there for a long moment, the panicked horse forgotten, the world reduced to the space of a single stable stall, the air filled with the weight of a past that had just been dragged, kicking and screaming, into the present. He led her to a quiet corner, away from the nervous stamping of the horses. They sat on an overturned trough, the rough wood a solid presence in the wavering light. The rain on the tin roof was a constant, lulling rhythm, a sound that insulated them from the rest of the world. And in that small, safe space, she began to talk. "The letters," she said, her voice barely audible, "they stand for Sultan Creed." The name meant nothing to Elias, but he listened. His silence an invitation for her to continue. She told him of a small ranch in a valley 2 territories away, a place with good water and rich grass. She spoke of her husband, a good man with a gentle heart, and she spoke of the railroad, of Pike and Company's desire for their land. Sultan Creed had been Pike's foreman, a man with a charming smile and eyes as empty as a snake's. He had come with contracts, with promises of partnership, his words as smooth and deceptive as a river with a deadly undertow. Her husband had refused to sign. One night, the barn had caught fire. The flames had moved with an unnatural speed, fueled by something more than dry hay. Her husband had gone in for the horses. He had never come out. In the chaos and the grief, Creed had returned. He had called the fire a tragedy, an accident. He had offered his protection. When she had tried to run him off her land, he had shown her what his protection meant. He and his men had held her down. Sultan Creed himself had held the branding iron, heated in the embers of her own hearth. "It is so everyone knows who you belong to now," he had said. She fell silent, her hands twisting in her lap. Elias did not move, did not speak. He just sat beside her, a solid, unmoving presence, absorbing the horror of her story. His own anger was a living thing inside him now, a cold, hard knot of purpose. After a long silence, she stood up. "Wait here," she whispered. She slipped out into the rain and returned a few minutes later, her shawl soaked, her face grim. She was carrying the small, locked wooden box. She knelt on the hay-strewn floor and took a small key from a chain around her neck. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the box. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of worn velvet, were 2 objects. The first was an old survey map, the paper creased and yellowed. It showed her family's land, the boundaries clearly marked, and running through it, a thin blue line, was the same spring that fed Hart's draw. The map was the original deed, the true record of the land, a direct contradiction to the forged documents Pike was using. The second object was a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in a confident, looping hand. It was a confession, of a sort. It was Sultan Creed. writing to Bartholomew Pike, complaining that the agreed-upon price for the unfortunate accident at the Quinn Ranch had not been paid in full. It was a letter born of greed and betrayal, a detailed account of his crimes, signed with a flourish. "He never got to send it," she said. "I found it in his saddlebags the night I ran." She looked at Elias, her eyes a mixture of shame, fear, and a defiant anger that had been buried for years. "I was afraid," she said. "I thought if they knew I had this, they would hunt me down. I just wanted to disappear, but they are here. He is here, somewhere, working for the same man." Elias looked from the letter to the scar on her arm, and the pieces of his own struggle clicked into place. This was not just about his land anymore. It was about her. It was about a debt that had to be paid. He reached out, not to her, but to the small jar of lanolin he had left for her. He picked it up and pushed it gently across the wooden trough toward her. "Will this work on a scar like that?" he asked, his voice rough. It was a clumsy question, a simple, practical inquiry in the face of an immense, emotional wound. A ghost of her old, sad smile returned. "To fix a heart," she said quietly. "It would take a whole barrel." They sat in silence for a while longer, the rain their only companion. A new understanding had formed between them, an alliance forged in trauma and a shared enemy. "We fight them," he said finally. It was not a question. It was a statement. Together. She nodded, a single, decisive movement. He stood up and offered her his hand to help her rise. She took it. His grip was firm, calloused, and safe. He held her hand for a moment longer than was necessary, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "I will not touch you," he said, his voice low and solemn, his eyes meeting hers. "Not until you are ready." It was the most intimate promise he could have made. In that moment, he was not offering passion, but something far more valuable. He was offering her back the ownership of herself. And in the dim, rain-swept light of the livery stable, a fragile, new kind of fence began to be built. A boundary of trust and respect around two lonely people who had just discovered they were no longer fighting alone. Bartholomew Pike's next move was not with dynamite or hired guns, but with a piece of paper. He played the game of civilization, using the law as his weapon. A formal notice arrived, delivered by a circuit court clerk, granting Pike and Company legal access to Hart's Draw for the purpose of surveying the land for a public reservoir. It was framed in the language of public health and civic duty. It was a civilized mugging. The following morning, Sheriff Maddox, looking profoundly uncomfortable in his formal uniform, led a small procession to the gate of Elias's ranch. Behind him were two surveyors carrying tripods and measuring chains, their city clothes looking flimsy and out of place against the rugged landscape. Agnes Pike brought up the rear, her presence a clear signal that this was a family affair, a matter of Pike dominion. Elias was waiting for them at the fence line. He was not holding a rifle, but a heavy, leather-bound ledger containing his deed and the original survey maps of his property. He stood with his feet planted, as rooted and unmoving as the thick posts of his gate. Mara was beside him, her face calm and serious. She held a copy of the new, forged map, her finger ready to trace the parcel numbers. Sheriff Maddox cleared his throat and unrolled the court order. "Elias, the law says they have a right to be here." Elias did not look at the sheriff. He looked at the surveyors. "This is private land," he said, his voice flat. "The boundaries are clear." Mara stepped forward slightly. "The parcel number on your order," she said, her voice steady and clear, "corresponds to the public utility corridor on this new map. But on the original county survey, that same number is located a full half-mile to the east." She held up the two maps, the discrepancy obvious. Agnes Pike let out a derisive snort. Are we to trust the scribblings of this woman, a drifter with no history and sticky fingers? The rumor of theft, which had been a whisper in the church, was now a public accusation, a direct assault on Mara's honor. Before Elias could respond, a voice called out from the road. Deputy Cole was riding up, his horse kicking up small puffs of dust. He dismounted, his young face tight with an internal struggle. He avoided looking at the sheriff and addressed Elias directly, holding out a folded sheet of paper. "Mr. Hart, I was looking over some old tax filings from last year, filings made by Pike and Company. I thought you might find the paper they used to be of interest." Elias took the paper. It was the same thick, watermarked stock as the forged map. He looked at Cole, a question in his eyes. The deputy's gaze was direct. "They only make that kind of paper at the mill in Missoula," he said, his voice just loud enough for the group to hear. "It is a distinctive blend. It has only been in production for the last 6 months." The implication hung in the air, as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. A 6-month-old paper could not have been used for an official seal that was supposedly years old. The forgery was not just a suspicion anymore. It was a provable fact. Sheriff Maddox's face turned a mottled red. "Deputy, you are out of line." But the damage was done. The surveyors looked from the maps to the paper, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. For today, the confrontation was over. Maddox, flustered and angry, led his humiliated party back toward town. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Elias took Mara to a secluded spot down by the creek that fed his spring. The water whispered over smooth stones. A gentle, timeless sound. He was carrying his Winchester rifle. "You need to know how to use this," he said simply. "Not to go looking for trouble, but to be ready if trouble finds you." He showed her how to hold it, how the stock should feel firm against her shoulder. He showed her how to breathe. A slow, steady intake of air before the trigger pull. He stood behind her, his voice a low murmur in her ear, his instructions precise and patient. His hands, covered in worn leather gloves, would occasionally guide the barrel or adjust her stance. His touch was impersonal, instructional, yet it was the closest they had been. She could feel the solid warmth of his presence behind her, a living wall of safety. At first, her hands trembled. The weight of the rifle was the weight of all the violence she had known. But as she listened to his calm voice, as she focused on the simple mechanics of the machine, something inside her began to shift. She was not a victim here. She was the one in control. The power was in her hands. She took a breath, aimed at a tin can he had set on a distant stump, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion echoing in the small canyon. The can jumped and spun away. A slow smile spread across her face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. She was no longer just the woman with the scar. She was a woman who could make her own thunder. They stayed until the light began to fail, firing until her shoulder ached and her fear had been replaced by a quiet, steely confidence. As dusk settled, a light, misty rain began to fall. Elias built a small fire, the flames pushing back the gathering dark. They sat close, sharing the warmth, the smell of rain and wood smoke filling the air. The charged energy of the rifle practice had given way to a deep, comfortable quiet. He looked at her, at the way the firelight played in her hair, at the newfound strength in her eyes. He reached out and gently touched her hand, his calloused fingers resting on the back of hers. It was not a gesture of possession, but a question. She did not pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a thing of fire and passion, but of quiet discovery and profound relief. It was slow and gentle, a promise of safety, a confirmation of the trust that had been growing between them in the silent spaces of their lives. It was the taste of wood smoke and rain, and the hesitant beginning of a world made new. Later, back at the ranch, they stood by the old stone well. Their reflections looked back at them from the dark, still water below. The surface, which had been a mirror of his own solitude for so long, now held them both. A breeze stirred the air, and the image rippled, their two reflections merging into one. The land itself seemed to test their new alliance. A hot, dry wind blew in from the south for 2 days, a searing breath that rattled the cabin and made the air thick with dust. On the second night, the cattle grew restless, their lowing edged with fear. Elias went out onto the porch, Mara close behind him. In the distance, they could see them, a pair of glowing eyes. Then another, then a whole pack, wolves, drawn in by the dry weather and the scent of the herd. Without a word, they moved. He grabbed his rifle. She took the shotgun he kept by the door. They did not run toward the wolves, but worked together, creating a perimeter of noise and threat. He fired a shot into the air to the west. She fired to the east. The blasts echoed in the night. A coordinated defense. They reloaded and fired again. Their movements synchronized. A team working in perfect concert. The wolves, unwilling to challenge such a determined defense, faded back into the darkness. Elias and Mara stood in the quiet aftermath, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the night air, their shared confidence a palpable thing between them. A few days later, O'Rourke, the blacksmith, saw them in town, standing a little too close together as they examined a new bit for Luther. He leaned on his hammer, a wide grin spreading across his face. "I smell a wedding coming," he boomed, his voice carrying across the street. Either that or someone is rendering beef tallow. The same day, a rider came through from the north, a trapper heading south for the winter. He stopped at the mercantile for supplies, and he brought news. A man named Salton Creed, a hard case known for his work with the railroad, was back in the territory. He and a few of his men had been seen on the border, asking questions. The ghost from Mara's past was no longer a memory. He was a man of flesh and blood, and he was getting closer. The plan was born in the quiet hours after midnight, conceived in whispers over the flickering flame of a single lantern in Elias's cabin. It was a simple plan, built on the predictable cornerstones of human greed. Mara, her hand now steady, spent an evening hunched over a piece of aged parchment, painstakingly creating a forgery of her own. With a diluted mix of coffee and soot, she aged the paper. With a fine quill and a deliberate, slightly shaky hand, she drew a map. It was not a map of water, but of silver. She sketched a section of the Badlands to the north of Hart's Draw, a desolate, rock-choked canyon known locally as Coyote's Jaw. And in the heart of that canyon, she drew the symbol for a rich vein of silver ore. The next day, the map was left, seemingly by accident, tucked inside a ledger at the mercantile. Mara made a great show of searching for it later, her voice laced with a carefully crafted panic. She confided in another customer, a known gossip, that she had found the old map among her late husband's things and was hoping to have it assayed. She knew Agnes Pike was listening to every word, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The bait was set. Within 2 hours, the rumor of a silver strike in Coyote's Jaw was the only topic of conversation in Sundown. By nightfall, a telegraph message was on its way to Bartholomew Pike. While the rumor took root and grew, Elias rode out to the canyon. It was a natural trap, a narrow passage with high, crumbling rock walls. For 2 days, he worked with a crowbar and thick ropes, his muscles straining in the hot sun. He loosened a large section of the cliff face, a cascade of rock and scree, and carefully wedged it in place with heavy timbers. He tied the support ropes to a single, thick hemp line, which he ran down to a sheltered alcove near the canyon floor. The trap was silent, invisible, and deadly. He was not a man who enjoyed deception, but he had learned that to fight a coyote, you had to think like one. The waiting was the hardest part. 3 days passed. Then, on the 4th morning, a lookout Elias had posted on the high ridge came riding hard. A party of 6 men was heading for the canyon. Elias and Mara were in position long before the riders arrived. Elias was in the alcove, his hand resting on the thick rope, the Winchester rifle leaning against the rock beside him. Mara was high above, hidden on a narrow ledge overlooking the entire canyon floor. She lay on her stomach, the shotgun propped on a flat stone, its twin barrels pointing down into the killing ground. She was no longer just a mender of cloth. She was a guardian, her purpose as clear and cold as the rock beneath her. The riders entered the canyon in a cloud of dust and arrogance. Sultan Creed was in the lead, his confident posture a study in predatory grace. Behind him were 4 hired guns, men with hard, empty faces. Sheriff Maddox rode with them, his presence a pathetic attempt to lend the proceedings a veneer of legality. He was here, he would later claim, to investigate a potential mineral claim. Bringing up the rear, looking impatient and out of place, was Bartholomew Pike himself, his fine city clothes already covered in a film of red dust. They rode to the center of the canyon and dismounted, pulling out the fraudulent silver map. The canyon played tricks with the sound, their voices echoing in strange, distorted ways. The wind, which had been still, began to whisper through the narrow passage, shifting direction, kicking up small eddies of sand that seemed to fall from the rock walls like sand in an hourglass, marking the passing of their final moments of freedom. One of the gunmen, a lanky man with a nervous twitch, wandered close to Elias's position. He unholstered his pistol, his eyes scanning the rocks with a vague suspicion. He was less than 30 feet from Elias. High above, Mara drew a steady bead. She remembered Elias's words, his calm instructions by the creek. She let out a slow breath. She was not aiming for the man's heart or his head. Her fight was not with this nameless, twitching man. Her fight was for justice. She aimed for his hand. The blast from the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space. It sounded as if it had come from 3 places at once. The gunman screamed, not in pain, but in shock, as the pistol was torn from his grasp, the buckshot shattering the weapon's wooden grip and sending splinters flying. He clutched his stinging, empty, bleeding hand, his eyes wide with terror. Chaos erupted. The other gunmen drew their weapons, firing wildly at the canyon walls, the ricochets whining through the air like angry insects. Sultan Creed, however, was a different breed. He did not panic. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the high ledges. And then he saw her, a small figure, barely visible against the rock. He recognized her instantly. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He raised his pistol and fired, the bullet smacking into the rock just inches from her head. Mara did not flinch. She reloaded the shotgun, the metallic click of the mechanism a cold, deliberate sound. She rose to one knee, the torn sleeve of her dress falling away to reveal the ugly, puckered brand on her arm. Creed saw the scar, and his smile widened. He began to walk toward her position, confident, unhurried. "You should have stayed gone. Little Sparrow," he called out, his voice echoing in the canyon. Mara stood her ground. "My name is not something you get to brand," she called back, her voice ringing with a strength she had not known she possessed. It was the moment Elias had been waiting for. With a single, powerful slash of his knife, he cut the rope. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a low groan came from the rock wall above, a sound of immense weight shifting. It grew into a roar as the entire section of the cliff face gave way. A torrent of rock and dirt thundered down into the canyon, a dusty, unstoppable avalanche that completely blocked the entrance. The trap was sprung. Their only way out was gone. Before the dust had even begun to settle, another figure emerged from behind a cluster of boulders near the now blocked entrance. It was Deputy Cole, his face grim, his pistol drawn and steady. He was not pointing it at Elias. He walked directly up behind Sheriff Maddox, who was staring at the rock slide in open-mouthed horror. "Sheriff," he said, his voice hard and clear, "you are under arrest for conspiracy and aiding a criminal enterprise." The The click of the handcuffs snapping onto the sheriff's wrists was the loudest sound in the suddenly silent canyon. Personal decency had finally triumphed over corrupt authority. Enraged, Creed turned his attention from Mara to Elias, who was now stepping out from the alcove. With a snarl, Creed charged, and the two men met in a brutal, wordless collision of muscle and bone. They fell to the ground, rolling in the thick red dust, their fight a desperate, primitive struggle for dominance. Bartholomew Pike, his face a mask of disbelief and panic, tried to flee. He scrambled up the side of the canyon, his expensive boots slipping on the loose scree. He stepped on a large, unstable rock. It shifted under his weight, and with a cry of pain, he tumbled backward, his leg twisting beneath him at an unnatural angle. The sharp, clean snap of bone was audible even over the grunts of the two fighting men. The land he had tried to steal had reached up and broken him. Creed, momentarily distracted by his employer's cry, gained the upper hand. He pinned Elias to the ground, his hand reaching for the knife sheathed at his belt. High above, Mara raised the shotgun one last time. She did not hesitate. She aimed low, at his feet. She fired. The blast tore the heel from Creed's right boot, the force of it throwing him off balance and sending a searing pain up his leg. He cried out, a sound of rage and agony, as Elias used the moment to throw him off and land a solid, finishing blow to his jaw. Creed slumped to the ground, dazed and defeated. It was over. As if on cue, a group of riders appeared at the top of the blocked canyon entrance. It was O'Rourke, the blacksmith, and a half-dozen other ranchers from the area. Cole had done more than just follow his conscience. He had brought witnesses. The deputy took charge, his movements crisp and efficient. He disarmed the remaining gunmen. He found the forged seal in Pike's coat pocket, and he walked over to where Mara was climbing down from her ledge, her wooden box clutched in her hand. He took the box gently. "May I?" he asked. She nodded and gave him the key. He opened it and removed Creed's signed, damning letter. The wind howled through the narrow passage, a mournful sound that seemed to pass through the very jaws of the coyote. It carried away the groans of the wounded and the whimpers of the defeated. High above, the thick layer of clouds that had covered the sky for days began to break apart. A single, brilliant shaft of sunlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the two figures standing in the center of the dusty canyon floor. They were dirty, bruised, and exhausted, but they were standing straight. The procession that returned from Coyote's jaw was a somber, silent affair. It was not the triumphant party of prospectors the town had expected, but a grim parade of justice. Deputy Cole rode at the head, his back straight, his face set in a mask of grim determination. Behind him, tied to their saddles, were Sultan Creed and his remaining men, their arrogance replaced by a sullen, defeated silence. Sheriff Maddox rode with them, his own hands bound before him, his face a pasty white with shame and fear. Bartholomew Pike was carried on a makeshift litter, his leg crudely splinted, his groans of pain the only sound breaking the rhythmic plodding of the horses. When they reached the main street of Sundown, the townspeople came out of their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They stood like statues carved from salt, watching as the man who had promised them a prosperous future was led to the small, dusty jail, a common criminal. The truth of what had happened in the canyon rippled through the crowd, a shocking wave that shattered the comfortable illusions they had been fed. The law in Sundown had not been upheld. It had been overthrown and then restored by the very people it had been used to condemn. The jail was too small for all the prisoners. Cole deputized O'Rourke and two other ranchers, solid men who understood the difference between law and power. They stood guard, their faces impassive, while Cole sent a telegraph message to the territorial capital, requesting the immediate attention of a circuit judge. The judge arrived 2 weeks later, a traveling dispenser of justice named Harlan Fisk. He was a lean, weary man with eyes that had seen every kind of human failing. He did not convene his court in the church, but in the saloon, a choice that seemed to scandalize Reverend Barlow and subtly please everyone else. Judge Fisk believed in conducting his business on neutral ground, and the saloon, with its smells of stale beer and regret, was as neutral as sundown got. The trial, as it were, was swift and decisive. There were no clever lawyers, only the hard, irrefutable weight of evidence. Deputy Cole presented the forged map and the sheet of paper from the Missoula mill. He presented the fraudulent seal he had found in Pike's coat, and he read aloud the letter from Salton Creed, the one that detailed the arson and the death of Mara's husband. Creed's confession, written in his own arrogant hand, hung in the silent room, a testament to a greed so profound it had consumed itself. O'Rourke and the other ranchers gave their testimony, their plain, honest words carrying more weight than any legal argument. When Mara was called to speak, a hush fell over the room. She did not speak of her own pain. She simply presented the original deed to her family's land, the true map, its faded lines a silent rebuke to the bold lies of the forgery. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, and when she was done, she pushed up the sleeve of her dress, the sleeve that had been mended and was no longer torn. She did not show them the brand as an accusation. She showed it as a fact. The two letters, SC, were a silent, final piece of testimony. Judge Fisk listened to it all, his expression unchanging. When the evidence was presented, he rendered his judgment. Bartholomew Pike was stripped of his franchise with the railroad, his assets seized to pay damages. Salton Creed and his men were sentenced to hang for their past and present crimes, and former Sheriff Maddox was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor for his complicity. The judge had one final piece of business. He turned his tired eyes on Agnes Pike, publicly slandering an innocent woman. He said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of law, is a crime against the community itself. It poisons the well of trust we all must drink from. He ordered her to make a public apology to Mara Quinn and to pay her all the wages she was owed, along with a punitive sum for the damage to her reputation. The next morning, in front of the Mercantile, the apology was made. It was not a scene of tearful remorse. It was a brief, excruciatingly awkward moment of humiliation. Agnes Pike stood on the porch, her face as hard as a winter apple. "I was mistaken," she said, her words clipped and bitter. Refusing to look at Mara, Miss Quinn's accounts were in order. She is owed an apology. She then counted out the money into Mara's hand, her fingers recoiling as if from a hot coal. Mara took the money without a word, nodded once, and walked away, her dignity a shield that Agnes's hatred could not penetrate. Her name was her own again. The events in Coyote's Jaw became a mirror for the town of Sundown. On the following Sunday, Reverend Barlow stood at his pulpit and delivered a sermon the likes of which his congregation had never heard. He did not speak of damnation or fire. He spoke of water. He spoke of how a community that allows one man to control the wellspring will eventually die of a thirst for justice. Water for everyone, he said, his eyes sweeping over the faces of his flock. Means little if the bucket is held only by the wealthy. It was a quiet, gentle admission of the town's own failing, a moment of collective soul-searching. Life began to find its old rhythms, but with a new, underlying harmony. At Hart's Draw, the work of the ranch went on. Elias and Mara repaired the stall the frightened horse had broken. The calves, having survived the hail and the threat of wolves, grew strong and fat. Together, they worked on the old stone well. The mortar between the stones had begun to crumble, and they spent a week carefully repointing it, mixing the mortar, pressing it into the cracks, their hands often brushing as they worked. They were not just repairing a well, they were patiently, carefully, mending the foundations of their own lives. Mara found a new kind of peace. She learned from an old woman in town about the properties of herbs. She would gather yarrow and comfrey and make a poultice, which she would apply to the scar on her arm each night. The mark would never disappear. She knew that. But the act of tending to it, of applying a soothing balm to an old wound, was a healing in itself. For the first time in years, she began to sleep through the night, the nightmares that had haunted her for so long. The dreams of fire and fear began to recede, slinking away like a hungry animal that has finally been driven from the yard. Elias changed, too. The walls he had built around himself, the fortress of silence, began to come down, stone by quiet stone. He started to talk more, not in long speeches, but in small observations about the weather, or the cattle, or the color of the evening sky. His sentences grew longer than 5 words. One evening, Mara found him at the kitchen table with a child's primer and a piece of slate, painstakingly practicing his letters. He looked up, a faint flush of embarrassment on his face. "Figured I ought to learn to write a decent hand," he mumbled. "Might need to write some invitations one of these days." O'Rourke, stopping by to deliver a new set of horseshoes, saw the two of them working together, their movements easy and familiar. He let out a booming laugh. "I get enough hammering at the forge all day," he said to Elias. "You two go ahead and get married, so the noise of the celebration can give my ears a rest." Deputy Cole, now acting sheriff, became the man he was meant to be. The badge no longer seemed too big for him. It fit. He rode out to the ranch one afternoon, his purpose clear. He told them he was riding to Missoula himself. He wanted an official, sworn affidavit from the paper mill. He wanted to make sure every piece of the case against Pike was as solid and unshakable as the mountains themselves. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Elias took Mara by the hand. He led her to a small, fallow plot of land behind the cabin, a place that got good sun and was protected from the worst of the wind. In the rich, dark earth, a dozen small, whip-thin saplings had been planted in neat rows. "Apple trees," he said. "They will take a few seasons to bear fruit." He reached out and gently touched the leaves of the nearest one. "They say the sourest apples need the most sunshine to turn sweet." He turned to her, his eyes full of a quiet, profound emotion. "And a sad person," he added softly, "just needs a person." The cold north wind, the one that carried the first real hint of winter, was blowing across Hart's Draw. It was a wind that scoured the sky to a pale, clean blue and made the newly repaired stones of the well feel ancient and cold to the touch. The sun was low, casting long, sharp shadows that stretched like grasping fingers from the cabin and the barn. Elias stood by the well, turning something over and over in his calloused hands. Mara came out of the cabin, a thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and walked toward him. The wind whipped a loose strand of her hair across her face, and she pushed it back, her eyes questioning. He did not speak at first. Words had always been the heaviest things for him to lift. Instead, he held out his hand. Lying on his palm was not a ring, not a piece of fancy jewelry from a catalog. It was a simple, narrow strip of leather he had braided himself, supple and strong. Fastened to it, serving as a clasp, was a single, plain silver button, worn smooth with time. It was unadorned, honest, and made to last. He looked from the simple object to her face, his gaze direct and unwavering. "If this feels right in your hand," he said, his voice a low rumble against the whistle of the wind, "then stay." It was not a question laden with poetry or promises of an easy life. It was a simple, profound offer. A place, a partnership, a home. Mara looked at the braided leather, at the steady hand that held it, at the man who had stood for her when the entire town had turned against her. She thought of the years spent running, of the constant fear, of the deep, weary loneliness that had been her only companion. Staying was a concept so foreign it felt like a dream. To stop running, to put down roots in this hard, beautiful land, to trust her heart to the quiet strength of this man. She hesitated for a single, long heartbeat. It was the hesitation of a creature that had been caged and was now faced with an open door, unsure if the freedom beyond it was real. Then, she reached out and took the leather cord from his hand. She wrapped it around her wrist. It fit perfectly. "I will stay," she said, her voice clear and strong above the wind, "but we share the key to the well." It was her own condition, her own declaration of partnership. It was not about the physical key to the lock he had on the well cover to keep animals out. It was a promise of equality, a statement that the wellspring of their life together, the source of their strength, would belong to them both. A slow, genuine smile spread across Elias's face, reaching his eyes and erasing the last of the shadows there. He nodded. "Together," he said, and the word was a vow. Their wedding was not held in the church. It took place in the yard of the ranch, under the vast, open sky that had witnessed all their struggles and all their triumphs. The late afternoon sun was thin and golden, the light of a season turning toward rest. There were no grand decorations, only bunches of wild asters and goldenrod that Mara had gathered from the creek bed, their bright colors a small rebellion against the coming gray of winter. Mr. O'Rourke played a mandolin, his big, clumsy fingers surprisingly nimble on the strings, the cheerful, plinking melody, a thread of joy weaving through the crisp air. Acting Sheriff Cole, his badge polished and his face scrubbed, performed the simple ceremony, reading the words from a small, worn book. He was their witness, the symbol of the new, honest law that they had helped to build. Nettie, the gruff owner of the boarding house, stood beside Mara. She sniffled once, then twice, and then pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and began to dote openly, muttering to herself about being a sentimental old fool. After the words were said and the promises made, O'Rourke struck up a waltz. Elias, his face a study in grim concentration, took Mara's hand and led her into a space cleared in the yard. He was a man who could move with a quiet grace on the back of a horse. But on his own 2 feet, set to music, he was hopelessly lost. He stepped squarely on her foot, corrected himself, and then, a few moments later, stepped on the other one. Mara leaned her head back and laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened delight. "You dance like a newborn calf," she teased, her eyes sparkling. "I will get the hang of it," he said, a sheepish grin on his face. "Before you are an old woman." They did not speak of love in terms of forever or of passions that would never fade. Their vows were as real and as solid as the earth beneath their feet, a testament to a love built on shared labor and mutual reliance. "I promised to start the fire every morning," he had said, his hand holding hers, "so you never wake up to a cold house again." And she had answered, "I promise to count the cattle when you are sick, so you can rest without worry." It was a pledge of practical care, a promise to share the burdens and the warmth of a life pieced together from broken parts. Later, as their few guests ate freshly baked cornbread and drank cider, Elias led Mara into the cabin. He walked to the mantelpiece, where the pair of tiny, scuffed leather shoes had sat for years, a solitary monument to his grief. He picked them up, holding them gently in his large hands. "For a long time, these were the only reason I kept going," he said, his voice thick with an old sorrow. He did not put them back in their lonely place. Instead, he walked to a new set of shelves he had built on the opposite wall, a place for their shared things, for Mara's books and her sewing basket. He placed the little shoes on the middle shelf, not hidden away, but as a part of their new life. He was not locking his past away. He was inviting her into it, allowing a cherished memory to be a part of their shared future, a story to be told, not a weight to be carried alone. The community, which had once eyed them with such suspicion, began to come around. The ranchers who had stood with them in the canyon were the first to offer their congratulations, their handshakes firm and their respect honestly won. Then others came. The people from town who had been swayed by Pike's promises and Agnes's poison. Their well wishes were a bit more awkward, their eyes a little less direct, but they came. It was not an easy or a sentimental reconciliation, but it was a beginning. It was the slow, difficult work of a community mending itself, of respect being rebuilt, one tentative conversation at a time. As the small celebration wound down and the guests began to depart, the sky, which had been clear, began to change. A soft, gray mist rolled in, and a gentle, soaking rain began to fall. It was not a violent storm, but a quiet, life-giving shower, a good sign for the apple trees. O'Rourke called out as he left, a perfect wedding gift from the land itself, and as the rain slackened, a faint, shimmering rainbow arched across the sky, its colors muted and soft, a fragile bridge of promise over Heart's Draw. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm took hold. Elias began digging a new series of irrigation ditches, a clever design he had worked out that would carry water from the spring to the new orchard while conserving every precious drop. He was no longer just surviving on the land. He was planning for a future, for a harvest that was years away. Mara found her own new purpose. She cleaned out a section of a small, unused outbuilding, turning it into a bright, airy sewing room. She put a notice up at the mercantile, offering lessons. The young women and girls of the town began to come out to the ranch, not just to learn to sew a straight seam, but to learn the practical skills of mending and making. In her quiet way, Mara was teaching them a form of self-reliance, giving them a skill that was their own, a small measure of independence in a world that offered them few. That night, their wedding night, the cabin was filled with a deep and profound quiet. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on the log walls. A single candle burned on the small table beside the bed. There were no grand pronouncements, no passionate declarations. There was only a quiet sense of homecoming. He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. It was a question, a silent request for permission. She answered by turning her hand and holding his, her fingers lacing through his own. It was a quiet affirmation, an act of trust more powerful than any spoken word. The flame of the candle danced, and the shadows on the wall grew long, and in the safe, warm space they had built together, their new life truly began. The seasons turned on the high divide, each one leaving its mark on the land and the people who called it home. Winter came, a hard, white silence that blanketed the world, and then gave way to a spring so vibrant and green it felt like a miracle. The story of the showdown in Coyote's Jaw became a local legend, a cautionary tale told around hearths and in the saloon, a reminder that justice in that high, lonesome country did not always come from a judge's gavel, but sometimes from the quiet courage of ordinary people who refused to break. The law, they learned, was only as strong as the decency of those who chose to uphold it, and love, they saw, was not a sudden blaze, but a slow, steady warmth that could heal even the deepest burns, but only when it was built on a foundation of respect. Elias Hart was a changed man. The quiet, defensive shell he had lived in for so long had cracked open, not in a violent shattering, but in a slow, gradual erosion. He still did not use 100 words when 10 would do, but his words were different now. They were not just the functional pronouncements of a survivor, but the shared thoughts of a partner. He had moved from a state of mere existence to a life of purpose. He was no longer just a man counting his cattle. He was a man tending an orchard, a man with a future to cultivate, a man with someone to care for. He was living. Mara's transformation was just as profound, but quieter, more internal. She had arrived in Sundown as a victim, a woman defined by a past she could not escape, her scar a secret mark of shame. But she was no longer a victim. The scar was still there, a permanent part of her history, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer a brand of ownership, but a testament to her survival. She did not hide it anymore. When she taught the young women in her sewing circle, her sleeves were often rolled up, and the mark was just another part of her, no more remarkable than the calluses on her fingers. She was redefining herself, not by erasing her past, but by owning it, by weaving it into the strong, resilient fabric of her present. The various conflicts that had once seemed so insurmountable had found their resolution. The struggle within themselves, the fight against past grief and present fear, had eased into a shared peace. The conflict with their community, the sharp edges of suspicion and judgment, had softened into a grudging and then genuine respect. Even their battle with the land itself, the harsh, unforgiving nature of the West, had transformed. They had learned to live in harmony with it, to read its signs, to respect its power, and in return, the land seemed to stand with them. The spring at the heart of their ranch, the source of all the conflict, now felt like a protected, sacred place. The symbols of their journey settled into the landscape of their lives. The stone well in the center of the yard was a daily touchstone. The rhythmic creak and splash of the bucket being drawn was a song of patience and perseverance. Its water was always cool and deep, a constant source of life, and Coyote's jaw, the place of their violent climax, fell silent. The winds of the high plains, indifferent to human drama, began the slow work of erasure, the red dust drifting down, softening the sharp edges of the rock slide, covering the tracks of the men who had come to steal and destroy. The land was healing itself, its memory long, its justice final. The lesson of Bartholomew Pike and his stolen water was not lost on the people of the territory. The idea of the public good was now viewed with a healthy dose of skepticism. They had learned that when the ink and the maps are in the hands of the powerful, such noble phrases can become a weapon. They learned that protecting the source of a community's water was the same as protecting its soul. The story left its own quiet echo in the hearts of those who knew it. They carried with them the warmth of a love that had been patient enough to wait for trust to grow. They remembered the sharp intake of breath at the sight of an old scar and the profound relief when justice, clean and undeniable, was finally served. The narrative of Elias and Mara was like the land itself, simple on the surface, but with deep, complex layers beneath. It had begun with a slow, warm burn of a growing connection, had tightened into the swift, dangerous coil of conflict, had exploded in a climax of rock and gunfire, and had finally settled into a gentle, lasting peace. The small twists and turns of their story became part of the telling. The brand SC had not been the mark of a mining company, but the brutal signature of Sultan Creed. Young Deputy Cole had not buckled under the pressure of a corrupt system, but had found the courage to follow the true law. And Bartholomew Pike had not been brought down by a hero's bullet, but by the very ground he had sought to conquer, his own greed causing him to fall. Their future was not a grand, dramatic story, but a series of quiet, deliberate acts. The apple orchard they had planted would need 3 full seasons before it offered up its first real harvest, and they knew that their love, like the orchard, would need constant, daily tending. It was in the small things, the fire he built each morning, the way she'd mended a tear in his shirt before he even noticed it, the shared silence as they watched the sun go down. One afternoon, O'Rourke came out to the ranch. His usual booming cheerfulness was absent, replaced by a deep sadness. His sister, back east, had died in a fever, leaving behind a young son with no one to care for him. The boy was being sent west on the train. O'Rourke, a lifelong bachelor, was at a loss. "I can shoe a horse and forge a plowshare," he said, his big hands twisting the brim of his hat. "But I do not know the first thing about raising a child." That night, Elias and Mara sat by the fire, the conversation with O'Rourke hanging in the air between them. They looked at the small, empty shoes on the shelf, no longer a symbol of loss, but of a love that had been real. "An orchard needs tending," Mara said softly, her eyes on the fire. Elias looked at her, understanding the unspoken thought between them. "So does a child," he answered. The next day, as evening settled over the ranch, they stood by the well. The air was cool and still. Elias drew up a full bucket of clear, cold water. He filled a dipper and handed it to Mara, their hands touching for a moment. "This sip is for yesterday," he said, his voice low and steady. He filled the dipper again, "and the next is for tomorrow." Mara took it, her eyes meeting his over the rim. She took a long, slow drink, the cool water a balm. Then she smiled, a smile that was full of the quiet, unshakable strength she had found. "The whole well," she said, "is for us." Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.